Why did American radio operators suffer casualty rates as high as 90% in World War II? How did a soldier, whose job was simply to communicate, become the most targeted man on the battlefield, more likely to die than riflemen, machine gunners, or even officers? And why, despite being considered non-combat specialists, did radio operators have a life expectancy measured in minutes once fighting began? We're going to answer all of that through the story of the men who carried the radios and why every enemy soldier was trained to kill them first. The radio operator story begins with a simple military truth. Modern warfare requires communication. Without radios, battalions become isolated. Companies can't call for artillery support. Platoons can't coordinate movements. Airstrikes can't be directed. Medical evacuations can't be requested. In World War II, the radio was the lifeline of every combat unit, and the man carrying it became the most important and most vulnerable soldier in the squad. The SCR-300 radio, nicknamed the walkie-talkie, was the standard infantry radio for American forces. It weighed 38 pounds with batteries. The operator carried it in a backpack-mounted frame with a long antenna extending several feet above his head. That antenna was the problem. On a battlefield where most soldiers stayed low, kept their heads down, and tried to blend into the terrain, the radio operator walked around with a 6-foot metal pole sticking up from his back. It was visible from hundreds of yards away. It marked him as clearly as painting a target on his uniform. German, Japanese, and Italian soldiers were all trained with the same doctrine: identify the radio operator and kill him immediately. Every manual, every training session, every tactical briefing emphasized this. The radio operator was priority target number one, even above officers. The reasoning was simple and brutal. Kill the radio operator and you blind and deafen the enemy unit. They can't call for support. They can't coordinate with adjacent units. They can't request ammunition or medical evacuation. They become isolated and vulnerable. One dead radio operator could paralyze an entire company. American radio operators knew this. Every man trained to carry a radio was told, explicitly and repeatedly, that he would be targeted, that the enemy would try to kill him before anyone else, that his life expectancy in combat was measured in minutes, not hours or days. But the military needed radio operators, and someone had to do the job. The training was intensive, but ultimately inadequate for what they would face. Radio operators learned Morse code, radio procedures, equipment maintenance, and basic tactics. But no training could truly prepare them for the reality of being the most hunted man on the battlefield. The antenna was the radio operator's death sentence. Standard procedure required extending it fully for maximum signal range. This meant a 6-foot antenna rising above the operator's head, visible from incredible distances, impossible to conceal. In the dense bocage hedgerows of Normandy, radio operators tried to keep the antenna below the hedge tops, but this reduced signal range, making communication difficult or impossible. Commanders would order the operator to extend the antenna fully, knowing it made them targets because the mission required communication. In the Pacific Theater, the jungle provided some concealment, but the antenna still protruded above vegetation. Japanese snipers, excellent marksmen, trained to pick targets carefully, would scan American positions looking for antennas. Once spotted, they would wait patiently for a clear shot at the man beneath it. One Marine radio operator described his experience on Guadalcanal. "You felt like you were wearing a neon sign that said, 'Shoot me.' Every time we stopped, I'd hear the snap of bullets passing close. The Japanese knew what that antenna meant. They wanted me dead more than anyone else in the squad." The Germans were equally systematic. Vermont training manuals from 1943 specifically instructed soldiers to identify radio operators by their antennas and eliminate them as priority targets. German snipers were equipped with scoped rifles and trained to hit targets at 600 meters or more. A radio operator with his antenna extended was an easy target at that range. Radio operators developed various techniques to try to survive. Some would extend the antenna only when actively transmitting, then lower it immediately, but this made communication sporadic and unreliable. Others tried camouflaging the antenna with foliage or painting it to match the surroundings. This helped slightly, but a 6-foot metal pole is difficult to hide regardless of camouflage. Some desperate operators tried using shorter antennas or bending the antenna to reduce its profile. But this drastically reduced signal range, sometimes making the radio useless. Field commanders would order the antenna extended properly because they needed reliable communication more than they worried about one man's survival. The casualty statistics were horrifying. In some infantry divisions during heavy combat, radio operators were being killed or wounded at rates exceeding 90% within the first week of sustained fighting. Units would go through 3 or 4 radio operators in a single day of intense combat. The 1st Infantry Division in North Africa reported that radio operators had the highest casualty rate of any specialty in the division, including combat engineers and forward observers. The 29th Infantry Division at Omaha Beach lost 26 radio operators in the first 2 days of fighting. The pattern repeated across every theater and every major battle.
The targeting of radio operators wasn't opportunistic, it was systematic and deliberate. Axis forces trained their soldiers to prioritize radio operators above almost all other targets. The doctrine was clear: disrupt enemy communications first, then engage other targets. German machine gun teams were instructed to target radio operators whenever possible. The MG-42, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, could put concentrated fire on a radio operator's position within seconds of identifying the antenna. Japanese machine gunners received similar training, with special emphasis on targeting radio men during American advances. Snipers considered radio operators premium targets. German snipers operating on the Eastern Front and later in Italy and France kept careful records of their kills. Radio operators, identified by their antennas and the radio sets on their backs, were noted as high-value targets worth waiting hours to eliminate. Japanese snipers in the Pacific were particularly deadly. They would position themselves in trees or camouflaged positions overlooking American lines, then wait patiently for radio operators to expose themselves. The distinctive antenna made identification easy even at long range through thick jungle foliage. Artillery observers were trained to call fire on positions where radio antennas were spotted. A radio operator's position indicated a command post or coordination point, making it a valuable artillery target. Soviet artillery doctrine specifically mentioned targeting radio antennas as indicators of enemy headquarters locations. The psychological pressure on radio operators was immense. They knew with absolute certainty that they were being hunted, that enemy soldiers were scanning for them specifically, that the equipment they carried marked them for death. Every time they extended the antenna, every time they transmitted, they were announcing their position to every enemy within visual range. One Army radio operator who served in the Battle of the Bulge later wrote, "I volunteered to be a radio operator because I thought it would be safer than being a rifleman. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The first guy I replaced was killed by a sniper on his second day. The guy before him lasted 3 days. I made it 2 weeks, which made me a veteran. Then I got hit by shrapnel from an artillery shell that was probably aimed at my antenna." The stress led to various coping mechanisms. Some radio operators became fatalistic, accepting that they probably wouldn't survive and focusing on doing their job well for however long they lasted. Others developed obsessive behaviors, constantly checking their surroundings, never staying in one position for more than a few seconds, always moving. The casualty rates for radio operators varied by theater and intensity of combat, but the pattern was consistent. In sustained heavy combat, radio operators died at rates 2 to 3 times higher than regular infantrymen. During the invasion of Normandy, the 4th Infantry Division reported losing 34 radio operators in the first week of combat. That represented nearly 100% turnover of radio operators in frontline units. Replacements arrived and were killed within days or hours. In the Pacific, Marine divisions reported similar statistics. The 1st Marine Division on Peleliu lost 41 radio operators during the month-long battle. The division had entered the battle with approximately 45 radio operators in combat roles, meaning nearly complete casualties among that specialty. The 101st Airborne Division during Market Garden lost 28 radio operators in 9 days of fighting. These weren't just wounded and returning to duty. Most were killed outright or so severely wounded they never returned to combat. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A frontline infantry company needed at least 4 radio operators, one with the company commander, one with each of the 3 platoon leaders. In heavy combat, these positions turned over every few days. A division engaged in sustained combat for a month might go through 200 or more radio operators as casualties and replacements. The replacement system struggled to keep up. Radio operator training took several weeks, and the casualty rates meant constant demand for replacements. By 1944, some divisions were assigning soldiers to radio operator duties with minimal specialized training, simply because they needed bodies to carry the radios. These hastily trained replacements died even faster than properly trained operators. They didn't know the proper procedures for minimizing exposure. They didn't understand the tactics for survival. They were given a radio, told basic operating procedures, and sent into combat where they typically survived less than 48 hours.
As the war progressed and the horrific casualty rates became impossible to ignore, attempts were made to improve radio operator survival. None of them worked particularly well. Some units tried using multiple radio operators in rotation, with men taking turns carrying the radio for short periods. This spread the risk, but complicated communication and meant more men were trained to be targets. Camouflage techniques were refined. Radio operators received training in concealment, using terrain features to mask their position, and techniques for operating radios from covered positions. But the fundamental problem remained. The antenna had to be extended and visible to work properly. Shorter antennas were tested and occasionally used, but they reduced range so significantly that they were impractical for most operations. A company commander needed to communicate with battalion headquarters several kilometers away. Short antennas couldn't reliably maintain that range. Some radio operators tried removing the antenna entirely when not transmitting and quickly extending it only when needed. This made them less conspicuous, but meant delays in communication that could be fatal in rapidly evolving combat situations. Technical improvements came slowly. Later in the war, improved radio designs with better sensitivity allowed slightly shorter antennas. But the improvement was marginal, and most units were still using earlier equipment. One adaptation that did help somewhat was tactical, keeping radio operators behind cover as much as possible, having them communicate from foxholes or trenches rather than exposed positions. But this only worked in static situations. During advances or movements, the operator had to move with his unit, antenna extended, completely exposed. By 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany and across the Pacific, radio operators continued dying at catastrophic rates. The Germans and Japanese, increasingly desperate, prioritized disrupting Allied communications even more than before. German defenders in the Siegfried Line and during the defense of the Rhine were specifically instructed to target radio operators. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima and Okinawa did the same. The doctrine hadn't changed, and neither had the results. On Okinawa, Marine divisions reported radio operator casualties exceeding 85% during the 3-month battle. Army divisions engaged in the fighting for Germany saw similar rates. The war was ending, but radio operators continued to die in disproportionate numbers until the very last days of combat. Some radio operators survived the entire war, though they were rare. Those who did often attributed their survival to luck rather than skill, being in the right place at the right time, having the enemy shoot at someone else, being behind good cover when the bullets came. One veteran radio operator who served from North Africa through VE Day later reflected,
I carried that radio through 3 years of combat. I saw dozens of other radio operators get killed. I don't know why I survived and they didn't. I wasn't better at the job. I wasn't luckier in any measurable way. I just survived. And I've spent 70 years trying to understand why. After World War II, military planners finally acknowledged what frontline soldiers had known all along. Radio operators were being killed at unacceptable rates. The distinctive antenna that marked them for targeting needed to be eliminated or reduced. Post-war radio development focused on shorter antennas, better signal processing, and eventually frequency hopping and encrypted communications that reduced the need for long antennas. By the Korean War, radio technology had improved enough that antennas were less distinctive. The radio operators still faced elevated risks. Modern military radios use antennas that are far less conspicuous, and communication doctrine emphasizes concealment and rapid movement. But the lesson learned at such terrible cost in World War II shaped all subsequent military communications. Never make your communicators obvious targets. The men who carried radios in World War II paid the price for technology that wasn't ready and tactics that didn't account for how valuable and vulnerable they were. They died at rates approaching 90% in sustained combat, killed by enemy soldiers who were trained to hunt them specifically. Their sacrifice enabled the communication that won battles and saved other soldiers' lives. But it came at a cost that, looking back, seems almost criminal in its preventability. The antenna could have been shorter. The radios could have been designed differently. The tactics could have protected them better. But they weren't. And thousands of radio operators died because they carried equipment that marked them for death and were sent into combat knowing they probably wouldn't survive. That is why 90% of American radio operators died in World War II, and why their story deserves to be remembered alongside the infantrymen, tankers, and pilots who are more often honored.